Sean, you want to give a countdown?
Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Chuck Hines. For people who don't know, I'm the current president of the East Cambridge Planning Team. That organization has been recognized by the city since 1965 as the official neighborhood organization of East Cambridge. We're here today to discuss the new proposal for a new location of the EVERSOURCE substation. And I'd like to just introduce people. Tom Evans, if you say hello.
Hi, Chuck. Hi, everyone.
From Cambridge Redevelopment Authority. From Boston Properties, we have Michael Tilford.
Yep. Hi, Chuck. How are you?
Good. And Eon Hatch.
Hi, Chuck.
And we also have Alex from the CRA that's going to be helping coordinate everything.
Hi, Chuck.
Hey. Okay, now Tom Lathan couldn't make this meeting, so he is not on the agenda tonight. And we're not going to be answering any engineering questions. I know we got a lot of those, and they have all been put together and be compiled, and possibly maybe a second meeting to address those issues. So nobody here will be able to answer them. So just to let you know the type of meeting, I'm calling this a town hall. It's not an official East Cambridge Planning Team meeting. So there's going to be no motions, no votes, no letters, no deliberations. This is just to get the presentation out and get feedback at this point. We're a deliberative assembly. It's going to be tough trying to deliberate with Zoom to come up with any consensus. So Alex is here. Hi, Alex. Can you say hello again, Alex? She's going to be coordinating everything. This meeting is being recorded live, and it's also on CCTV, channel 9. Now, all emails and posts to the Google group is being compiled and will be published. That we see this afternoon. The Zoom protocol. We will see the person speaking. We will not see the person speaking except for panelists. Regular Zoom meetings, when someone talks, they automatically come up. Only the panelists will be, faces will appear. To verbally ask a question, there's a virtual hand on the right side of the screen. In the bottom of the screen, you can have put in written questions. Please, when you do raise your hand and you have the floor, please state your name, any organization you're with, and just your street name, where you live, not the number, just the name of the street. And keep questions and answers short and to the point. Now for the CCC protocol, questions by phone, dial 617-492-6800 to speak with a representative who will send your questions to the Zoom meeting presenters. That's for the, excuse me, back up. The Zoom protocol. Okay. Oh, the CCT protocol. Questions by phone, dial 617-492-6800 to speak with a representative who will send your questions to the Zoom meeting presenters. When you call, if you hear a recording, please just stay on the line and to be connected to an operator. Questions can also be sent by email at planning, PLANNING, at cambridgeredevelopment.org. Please state your name and organization you represent, if you do, and street name to the representatives or with written comments. And I wanted to put together special thanks to Susan Fleischman, the Executive Director of CCTV, and Sean Eiffel, the Associated Director of Operations for CCTV, for helping put this together. Alex, is there anything you think I missed?
Only comment is we do have a request for people to speak louder and a bit closer to their mics.
Okay, can you hear me very well?
Yes.
Okay, I'd like to turn over the meeting to Tom Evans, who's going to go through the presentation. We asked to hold all questions until the presentation is over. We can go back to a slide if necessary for any clarification questions. Tom?
Thank you, Chuck. So the CRA is happy to participate in this experiment of a town hall meeting with ECPT as we try to adapt to new protocols for social distancing, while also trying our best to conduct our community outreach for projects. So this is our first attempt at this. We've tried a dress run with CCTV, and we really appreciate all the support for everyone's technology challenges. We've tried to provide many options to get in touch with us, and I'm sure there will still be struggles, but we appreciate everyone's patience, and we look forward to be able to have a continuation of this conversation in a more regular setting as soon as we are able. I might go through a PowerPoint presentation on my screen. I'll shift that over in just a second. The goal of that will be to provide just an overview of the planning context for this project and start to lay out our initial thinking about how the substation could be moved into the Kendall Square Urban Renewal Plan area. And most importantly, lay out the steps moving forward after this, because this is just the very beginning of a conversation we're going to continue to have with the community, while we're also learning more from the technical capacity of EVERSOURCE and understanding the development options from Boston Properties. So I'm going to move to my screen here. Is that thumbs up? Okay. So I'm working on advancing it. I'm now having technical issues on our computer side. Hold on a second. There we go. Just again to review, as Chuck outlined, we wanted to find many ways for people to put in questions at the end of the presentation. On Zoom, you can raise your hand or hit the Q&A via a Google Doc. The agenda for our conversation is to go over the timeline of how this particular project intersects with two efforts. One was the effort to find an alternative location for EVERSOURCE substation, and the ongoing work that we've been doing to complete the infill development concept plan with our development partners, Boston Properties. We're going to talk through a couple alternatives that did come up as we were exploring what options there might be in Kendall Square, specifically in the MXD district, and then start talking about some of the analysis we need to do moving forward. It's really key to understand that this process really began, well, the process over in the gray slide, the gray buttons over there, began with EVERSOURCE announcing their property. I'm afraid that some of them, you may have some of the slides blocked. I've noticed that there is a little toggle at the top of the top right-hand side of your screen, if you're watching on Zoom, where you can diminish the pictures of people if you want to see things on the right-hand side of the slide. So as EVERSOURCE announced their substation need, the city manager gathered a number of the property owners in the area, and the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority was brought into that conversation to search for alternative solutions for the site. We have been undertaking a 5-year effort to plan out and implement the build out of the MXD area in conformance with the K2 plan that CDD had published in 2013. That initial planning process ended with the zoning and urban renewal plan amendment that was approved in 2015. we began work on the schematic design for the new Akamai headquarters, which was approved in 2017. We amended the infill development concept plan later to place commercial development on Main Street, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And as we started to look at how the MXD development continues to evolve, as EVERSOURCE stepped in, we started rethinking some of our assumptions. So for everyone's orientation, I think I have a cursor here that I will try to illustrate. The MXD district is this red line here that we often describe as a ski boot, and includes 3 major redevelopment parcels. The urban renewal plan originally actually also contained the Volpe site between 3rd and Binney. Most of our conversation this evening revolve around what we call Parcel-2, which is a numbered designation from the 60s. That is the block between Broadway, Binney, Galileo, and the 6th Street Walkway. When the urban renewal plan was first amended in 2015, we had planned most of the development to happen on that block. There was a plan for a new Akamai headquarters at the corner of Broadway and Galileo, residential development on the North Garage, or what's often called the Blue Garage, and then another development site on what at the time was called 14 Cambridge Center, which is the low industrial building currently occupied by Thermo Fisher. Other relevant elements of the plan involved the proto building on Ames Street, some work we've been doing with Broad Institute at 75 Ames Street, and some repositioning of the building at 255 Main Street. Overall, the redevelopment plan allowed an additional 1 million square feet of new development, 60% of that being office, 40% is housing. It came in as proposed 2 buildings, 2 office buildings and 2 commercial buildings. At the beginning of last year, the plan was amended to shift the commercial development from the Thermo Fisher site, which I previously mentioned, down to 325 Main Street. The key element of that is to this is the MIT Coop building, which has been demolished and is being redeveloped to be an expansion office for Google. Akamai's headquarters at 145 Broadway opened in this fall, and we were engaged in schematic design review for the residential building on this North Garage parcel at 135 Broadway. And here's an image of how that development was planned to lay out, again, with the Akamai building next door to a set of residential buildings, one taller tower on Broadway and a smaller building closer to Galileo, and the Google building on Main Street. So intersecting with this was the proposal for an EVERSOURCE station on FULKERSON, which is illustrated here in orange. Just for context, the north parcel we were just talking about is here on Binney Street. This parcel was originally approved for 40 housing units and a special permit in 2016. EVERSOURCE purchased the parcel in 2017. Once that proposal came through, there were a number of community concerns raised right away: the proximity to the Kennedy Longfellow School and the park nearby, and also the residential neighborhood of Linden Park, shown here in the background. And so that's when the city manager led an effort to try to find an alternative site. Here's just another view of the FULKERSON site as viewed from the Kendall Square area. And so the main objective of our search for a site was to try to find a location that was farther away from the residential neighborhood and closer to the commercial development that the substation was designed to help serve. The first parcel that came up in the conversation was Binney Street Park, or as what we had called it, PORKCHOP Park, because of its shape. The parcel is owned by the Redevelopment Authority. It's a bit of a originally rail yards that had run through, connected to the Grand Junction line. It has been in the planning works for over 10 years as a public park. It was identified by the CRA and the city as an open space compensation for the roof garden diminution from the Google development. It then became part of the programmatic open space planning that was run by CDD, the East Cambridge Kendall Open Space Committee, and the Connect Kendall Design Competition. The parcel is about 1 acre, so it fit well with the acreage and space requirements of the EVERSOURCE proposal, and it was also closer to the commercial activities, so those were benefits of that parcel. But some of the challenges as we looked closer at those options was that the open space component was not only related to the broader regional open space plans, but was specifically linked to the development requirements of MXD, the MXD zoning and the urban renewal plan to have this acre of open space, that we'd have to find other suitable sites for that open space. The parcel also contains a number of infrastructure networks underneath it. There's a major stormwater line being constructed right now. There's a steam line connecting across the street to the Amgen property, and some significant telecom cables, not just regular telephone cables, but regional distribution coming from AT&T and Verizon. And the parcel, being a pork chop shaped parcel, was a bit awkward. The substation design parameters would prefer something that was more rectilinear. And so there are a lot of technical reasons why the pork chop was not fitting with EVERSOURCE's needs. And I think most importantly is the city had put together a pretty robust plan for a community open space that is planned to go into construction next year. It was going to include a continuation of the Grand Junction multi-use path, a significant dog play area, and some passive recreation. And so the CRA was a bit concerned actually when this was initially proposed as an EVERSOURCE substation location because of our interest in preserving the open space plans for the MXD area. So over the summer, as the city manager is facilitating conversations between property owners, the conversation, as we looked at lots of other parcels with Boston Properties, had us starting to look at the north parcel where there's a parking garage. It's not a vacant piece of land, but it is not currently used for significant office or residential use. So it seemed like something worth exploring. The Blue Garage was built in 1990 to serve primarily the commercial buildings immediately surrounding it on parcel 2. It does have some public access parking allowance. There's over 1,100 parking spaces currently in the garage. Most of those are committed to leases of the neighboring office buildings, and also has bike parking as well. And is served by 2 private access roads, East and West Drive, on either side of it. Here's a few illustrations of the Blue Garage. This was actually before the Akamai building went up, so you can see its general form. It's flanked on the north and the south by 2 smaller parks. When Boston Properties first started exploring this, we were trying to understand all the technical challenges related to access to the parking garage site through the small open spaces, and also the challenge of dealing with all that parking. The other major technical issue that needed to be reviewed as well, whether this site would actually work for EVERSOURCE. Is there good access to it for their transmission and distribution lines? And it is narrow, and we asked EVERSOURCE to take a good hard look at it. They have to do a significant amount of due diligence and started diving into that in late 2019. There are a lot of challenges that are obvious about this site as a utility site. First and foremost on our minds is how to relocate all of that parking, both temporarily as the parking garage is demolished and then in a permanent solution. The other key thing that was central for our thoughts about the project is that, as I illustrated earlier, this was the site of the housing component of the MXD rezoning. And so finding a location in the MXD to meet that housing obligation was central for us. We want to understand the impacts on open spaces and whether there's other enhancements to open space that we could do to compensate for any changes or reduction of those open space parcels. It's a more expensive parcel to work with, not only because of its narrowness, but also because of the parking demand. And so that is something that has to be looked at very carefully by both EverSource and Boston Properties. And we just really need to keep in mind that the access for the wiring and service operations of that location works. But to date, we have not found any fatal flaws with this functionally from a substation standpoint. And so it was earlier this year that Boston Properties and EverSource were able to come to the city manager saying that they actually think that there is a workable alternative location at this site. So this image just shows the parking garage in context with the development we were talking about earlier. The proposal right now to use the blue garage site would require an amendment to not only the Kendall Square Urban Renewal Plan, but also the MXD zoning, which both have to go to City Council through the CRA and Planning Board. The proposal from a site planning standpoint would require that the parking garage is removed and the substation would be located in the middle of the block where the parking garage is currently. All of that parking would then need to be buried underground in some configuration. The residential development that had previously been slated to be bookending the parking garage would be merged together in one building on the south side of the parcel. It would keep its 25% below market requirement, which is a specific requirement of the MXD that goes a little bit beyond the inclusionary zoning of the city, which is that 20% is standard affordable for low and low mod, and then there's a middle income component of 5% of the units. This proposal would be for all that housing to be rental in one structure. And then to provide the economics to pay for the site and the relocation of the parking and a very significant technical challenge of putting a substation on a parcel, there is the proposal for 2 additional commercial buildings. Both we believe would be located on the same parcel, one on the other end of the garage and another on most likely the site that had previously been designated as a potential potential commercial site. So just to walk around the garage site itself, this is a series of images. On the left are views from Broadway with the Akamai building as it's finalizing construction. This obviously was taken in the summer. As you start to walk up the service alley, the image on the right starts to let everyone see the massing that is there now with the parking garage. The side alleys are used for predominantly access to the garage. There are some transit functions there. Biogen runs their own shuttle buses that use the side spaces. And there's a fair amount of deliveries to the commercial buildings. On the north side, as shown on the right-hand side of your screen, is the view from BINNEY and at the Galileo curve, and the second small open space is illustrated or is visible in that view. So this illustration is designed just to kind of show at a really conceptual level what the concept is. This is a section slicing through the north parcel right down the middle of the garage. Shadowed here in gray are the buildings. This view is looking west, and so the gray buildings are the existing buildings. To the left is the new Akamai building, and the two lower buildings are both occupied by Biogen. The current development proposal, as I mentioned before, has two housing components, a 350-foot tower on one end and a lower tower about 170 feet on the other end, that would meet the housing obligation of 420,000 square feet of residential. The top of the parking garage was being studied for a small amount of open space for the residents and potential solar array, and most of the parking was going to remain in place as a garage standing between those two residential. This is this same development just shown in a wireframe diagram so to strip out all the details, just to show the general shape and height of things. The proposal would require taking all that parking, putting it underground below grade, which comes at a great expense into urban fill, which has many challenges, not only just of digging and removing of the earth, but some of that soil is probably going to require some special treatment. And once that is removed, then the new substation can go at grade in the middle. The residential building would, again, have to be taller in order to carry the residential component of the two previous buildings. And there is then a commercial building on the Binney Street end, shown here in blue. One of the other elements of the project that we've just beginning to understand is the substation doesn't just sit there by itself, but actually requires a fair amount of connectivity to the electrical grid. We understand from EVERSOURCE that there's actually some benefits to this location from the transmission access that has to reach not only the Somerville station, shown here to the north. These are run across to the Kendall Square substation right by Broad Canal, and then two separate lines that need to reach Boston to get to the existing Brighton substation. And so in addition to the location of the substation, then we have to plan out the routes for a fair number of transmission lines into the site. As we've seen the design so far, the plan is that the transmission lines would come in from Broadway into the substation, and then out the other side on the Binney Street would then be distribution lines that would then feed out to the commercial area and the neighborhood. So high voltage on one end and I guess medium voltage on the other. For our work now moving forward, we have to get a full understanding of all the substation technical engineering issues, at least to the point that we can understand where on the site certain things can be, not only the substation, but where are the conflicts between the residential and commercial uses for access to the substation, access to parking. So understanding what the needs of the substation and the transmissions are, and then layering on top of that and making sure we are always driving for the strongest public realm possible. We want to balance those substation needs with improvements to the streets, the side alleys, and public space in the area. Understanding the transportation challenges of the additional development, but also the transition as the side streets are utilized for construction and access. So there's not only vehicular access, but we have to look at truck and service access to the substation, as well as understanding how this development fits in with the transit network in the area. We're going to look at a series of environmental impacts specific to the site for everything from stormwater to energy demand. We are required, the CRA will need to submit a filing into MEPA for the change to the urban renewal plan. So one of the technical elements of any time we do additional development in the MXD, we have to do an additional approval to the state through MEPA. We also need to make sure that the substation is placed and designed in a way that provides as minimum impact as possible to the existing offices there and the future residents of the block. And all that layers into a number of urban design considerations that go from architectural treatment of the substation, the design of the residential and commercial buildings, and then the public space feeding them. One key element we've been really focusing on within North Parcel is enhancing the North Parcel's connectivity to the neighboring sites. Most prominently is the Volpe site, which is being redeveloped by Matimco just to the east of the site. Illustrated on the bottom of your screen are two different planning documents that are both pointing to some of the same principles. The infill development concept plan with the pink lines and the orange lines from the Volpe design guidelines, all really urging enhanced connectivity to between the Volpe site and this parcel. And we think that this is definitely one of the opportunities for making public realm improvements that come with removing that garage and putting it underground and working access around the future substation. So the process we have to go through, as I mentioned before, is a new zoning for the MXD, not only to make sure that the substation is an allowed use, but also to make a few changes to the residential requirements and most prominently adding additional commercial entitlement into the MXD. Likewise, the same set of changes would need to be made to the urban renewal plan. That plan needs to be approved not only by the CRA and the City Council, but needs to go to the Department of Housing and Community Development for their approval. That state action requires a MEPA analysis where we will look at traffic issues, water issues, energy issues, and a whole set of MEPA requirements, as we have done previously in our urban renewal plan amendments. And then separately, the DPU must review all sites for proposals for substations. So EVERSOURCE has their own state review process that they need to initiate. They have planned to initiate that at about this time next year. And so in order for them to move forward with this alternative site, we need to make sure we have a clear plan for how the site would be designed within the next years in order to give them the ability to move forward with that application. So that's the update from the CRA about where we are in this plan. As I mentioned, this is just the very beginning of a conversation with the community and with the city. We look forward to the opportunity to have other workshops, other venues for this conversation. But for now, we are working with our social distancing technology through Zoom and email and phone. And so, again, a reminder of the ways to get in touch with us. We will, I believe our plan was to take questions in groups of 3 or so we can collect a bunch of questions and then send it to the panel for follow-up answers. I will say that probably many of the technical questions that will come up and some that I've already seen will have to be taken back to be analyzed by either the architect and the developers for the developer, Boston Properties, or the more challenging questions related to electricity and distribution and demand and so forth will have to be run back to EVERSOURCE, and we will come back and present response to that at a forum to come. So with that, I think I'd like to turn the baton back to Chuck if you want to call for questions or from the ECPT.
Yeah, let's take some questions of people who are on Zoom first. If you raise your hand, I don't think I can. Alex, are you going to be able to?
Yes, I do. So I just saw that Alon Levy has raised his hand. So Alon, in just 1 second, I'm going to unmute you and you're going to be able to speak. All right, Alon, you're unmuted.
Yeah, hey Tom, hey everyone. My question is more related to the negotiation about the 800,000 square feet. That extra density seems quite enormous for the cost. Is there an estimate of the cost of the parking? And are other actors and developers in the Kendall Square area, have they been pulled in to figure out if there is a way to lighten the financial burden so that the request and the ask of density is not so high? And also in the same vein, this adds an extra 800,000 square feet where we already are close to capacity with the current improvement. So how does that impact what EVERSOURCE and the energy consumption again on the area? So those are kind of my two questions, and like kind of when are the negotiations going to take place for the density? Have other developers been contacted for the finance, and if not, if that is can be done, and how is that going to impact the actual load that's being constructed at that site? Thank you.
How does anyone else? Do we want to?
There's no one else who has their
Okay.
hands raised yet.
So, as mentioned at the onset, I think understanding the load planning for EVERSOURCE is something that we will take the questions back to them. They, in our conversations with EVERSOURCE to date, they have a series of models that they have run in order to design that, and we can understand the capacity for additional development that they've built into their planning. I'm not sure if, Mike, if you'd like to talk a little bit about the burden of the parking undergrounding and the discussions to date from other developers in the area about how to provide interim parking solutions.
Great. No, thanks, Tom. Can everybody hear me, first of all? Thumbs up. Okay, good. Never quite thought I would miss the East End house so much, but here we are. So yeah, Tom, I think you're correct on the EVERSOURCE question. On the other two, we spent the last 8-9 months finding out if this is physically possible. And what we've come to the conclusion that ties into the question about other developers. One, we have 1,100 parking stalls above ground now in a pretty large garage that are contractually obligated. If it weren't for Alexandria helping us find a solution for those parkers in what could be a 2 to 3 year construction window, it's way too preliminary to tell, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation. So other developers have been meaningfully participating, specifically Alexandria. And that's the extent of that question. As far as the cost of the garage, that's a very, very easy one. Taking 1,100 spaces underground is exceptionally expensive because you're in an urban environment, demolishing, excavating at the same volume, and then replacing it with a conditioned space, because underground parking has MEP mechanicals, whereas you can see from the site that Tom showed that passive ventilation is there. So it's a massive expense, and it's one that can be very quantifiable. As we advance designs past these preliminary conceptual stages, it's going to be pretty easy to bid.
Okay, Alon, does that answer your question completely?
No, not completely, because I was like, because I was still like kind of thinking like, you know, I know that Alexandria stepped up, but there is still Metimco, Biomed, everyone is getting more density. You know, Biomed is coming to us with another 300 feet building that they want to build on 3rd Street. So there is still more density and more developers that are in the area that are going to be consuming energy and that are responsible for the fact that we have to have that substation in that area, right? If there wasn't so much density and if we had a plan, we wouldn't have that problem. So I'm wondering if those have actually been told this is the cost you can set up, here's a pool in order to get this achieved, step up to the plate so that we actually lower a little bit the density that we have to impose. Because again, 800,000 square feet, and especially the way it is positioned, is quite substantial.
Yeah, I'll do, we're not, as much as I'd like to be in a position to tell our competitors and colleagues in the development world they must participate, it's not really a role that we get to play. However, and I think I gave you the list, Alexandria is the group that has worked in close partnership with us and who has been great partners.
Okay, we have Stephanie who would like to say something, like to ask a question. And I think.
Yep, so I see Stephanie Couch and I also see James. So Stephanie, I'm gonna have you unmute you and have you ask your question, and then I'll immediately unmute James as well. Write your questions down and then answer them efficiently. So Stephanie, you are now unmuted.
It looks like she's still muted.
So
Okay,
Stephanie,
there we go.
yeah.
Okay, thanks. Stephanie Couch, Rogers Street. My question has to do with safety. I was one of the ones who was concerned about having the substation near the school and near Linden Park. And I'm wondering if someone could speak to the issues of still having residential housing bookending the substation, as well as people who are working nearby. And it's just an area I don't know enough about. So if somebody could address the safety, human safety issues.
So, what I know about electricity personally can about fit, what I don't know can fit in the Grand Canyon. I use the lights, but, we have substations. They're actually everywhere when you start paying attention to them, both near housing as well as commercial developments, including a couple that we own. So when we understand the capacity of the station more specifically, we're going to conduct third-party analysis around those things specifically. But obviously, we have a group of tenants that we've been informed of this plan, and we've been hearing their concerns and can look to answer them. But again, there are substations everywhere nearby to residential and commercial.
Great, thank you. James, I'm going to unmute you and then I will read Heather's question.
Hey,
James, you're unmuted.
Could you give us your name and what street you live on?
Hi, James Williamson. I live in North Cambridge. I have a number of friends who live in East Cambridge, but I think this is obviously a citywide and a regional issue, not just a more local issue, though my heart goes out to the people who live in East Cambridge who are being battered with this. To me, just excessive commercial, mostly commercial lab office development, and I don't think it's sustainable. I have two questions. The first is, why does it all have to be in Cambridge when we have a neighbor, Somerville, who are begging for relief on their residential property tax base, which they depend on much more than Cambridge do. And there is development beginning to emerge in parts of Somerville, which is, even that is controversial, but if done well, we could share some of the commercial development with our neighbor, and I think that would be could be seen as a quote win-win. That's my general view, but it's a sort of it's a general question which maybe someone wants to speak to, but a more specific question has to do with transportation. Is the parking freeze that exists in Cambridge relevant to this? And if so, how? And I understand this would be just a preliminary take on how that might be relevant or might apply to this proposal in its early stages. And secondly, anybody who tries to take the red line, and this has been brought up over and over again and ignored and ignored and ignored. We have it's not just electricity infrastructure we have to think about, it's the transportation infrastructure. I did see it mentioned in the slide, one of the slides that Tom Evans presented. What is the evolving thinking about where we are with our transportation infrastructure? I don't think this is sustainable. If you take the red line, you sometimes have to wait 3 trains to be able to even squeeze on during what's called rush hour right now as it is. So I'd be interested to hear some of the planning and thinking. I understand it's on a preliminary basis around that issue as well. So thank you for hosting this.
So, am I unmuted? On the regional question, I think that there was, I think, some exploration of where else in the grid EverSource could provide this, and they would have to understand where exactly the.
But excuse me, Tom,
I
understand that if all the commercial development is in Kendall, the substation is probably more likely to be preferable in proximity. I'm asking, I guess, a broader question, which I don't expect you to necessarily have a comprehensive answer to, which is the development itself, which in turn is seemingly necessitating the additional electricity infrastructure. So it's about more than, my question is really about more than just the electricity.
I understand. Okay, so this may or may not be true, but I'm pretty sure Boston Properties, who owns the site that is being proposed as the alternative, does not own any land in Somerville. And so the commercial development component is a price that they're negotiating for in order to bring the substation onto their property, which currently does have a productive use for them. It is host of 1,100 cars, and just though we will be studying very carefully the safety issues and other externalities of having a substation, in general, that's not something that enhances your property value, and is the site itself will lose value just for having the substation there, not to mention the cost of facilitating it. So that's the issue, is that the property owner offering the site to EverSource only has land in this conversation in Cambridge, and I guess land in Boston. But the entitlement world of commercial and residential development is local decisions with local property owners. So I think that's the hard thing about facilitating a swap with Somerville. I'm not sure if Mike, you want to add anything to that. I'll then take a dive into the transportation conversation.
No, Tom, I think you got it. It's a great urban economics question, and just for context, was probably not too far from this time last year when DPW made us aware of this issue. Peripherally been aware of it, and asked a lot of other developers too, what they could do to solve it. So our holdings are very immediate, and we don't, as Tom said, have anything in Somerville. So we looked to what we have available and had to start getting creative with the parking garage. But that doesn't explain the broader question about Somerville stuff. That's a planning urban economics question, which is a good one.
Though I'm pulling up the slide of the map just for thinking a little bit about the transportation issue. We're pretty aware of the challenges that the MBTA has been having in providing reliable transit service to Kendall Square. The CRA, along with Boston Properties and a number of property owners in the area, participated in an extensive planning process originally hosted by the state, the Kendall Square Mobility Task Force. We dove into a number of issues that we felt needed to be looked at deeply by both the city and the state in order to maintain the very high transit ridership mode share that we have in the commercial area of Kendall. The Red Line was one of the key focus points of that. We've had lots of conversations with the T about the improvement that they forecast on having new trains on the Red Line to increase reliability and to decrease headways. We've been very critical of some of their assumptions because we want to make sure that the headways they're talking about are actually technically possible. So we've had a lot of thoughts about how to make the red line better. But we've also, in addition to that, started looking at other ways to move people into Kendall Square through transit. We took a pretty deep look at bus routing options to improve connections to Kendall Square, which evolved the bus network in the area has not evolved since Kendall Square has become such a prominent commercial hub. And so we laid out a number of bus planning options, both with the MBTA and also considering Easy Ride Shuttle, which serves North Station. And the third component of that planning process was to take a really strong look at the Grand Junction rail line, which is illustrated here. It's actually labeled as Fulkerson Street on this map, just to move that over, and look into ways that that rail line, which goes down to Austin and then goes to North Station, could serve as a future transit connection. It doesn't necessarily help the red line connections that are going from North Cambridge to downtown, but helps with other connectivity options, whether it's connecting people that might be coming from the north or from the west. And so we hope to we've had some initial conversations with the state about this, and we hope to accelerate those conversations because we think the Grand Junction happens to function as a junction between three growing areas of the region: the Austin area and Harvard's development there, Kendall Square, and then also a lot of the development going on near North Station, and also happens to swing through Cambridge Crossing. We specifically, the Redevelopment Authority has also been trying to usher investments in the transit system in Kendall Square in the near term through a program called the Kendall Square Transportation Enhancement Program, where we've committed money to try to do short order improvements to especially the bus network, but other elements that can provide immediate transit solutions to Kendall Square. We can't necessarily fix the red line issues with the fund that we put together, but we're trying to find other creative solutions to enhance transit, because we definitely want this development to happen in a manner that continues the strong transit ridership we've had in Kendall Square. Alex, who's running the technical elements of this, is leading an effort to put forth a new publication of transportation data we've been collecting over the past 20 years about Kendall Square, and we will be rolling that out real shortly, that continues to show the strong transit ridership we have in Kendall Square and the success we've had of discouraging single occupancy vehicles to the area. Our goal in the planning for this would be to continue to improve on that. Certainly discussing the demand for parking for the future development is something we'll be taking a close look at.
And can you speak to the relevance? What's the status of the parking freeze, and is that in what way is that relevant to some of these questions? And I thank you for your careful laying out of some of the various initiatives.
So there's two different parking challenges for the site. There is the existing parking that's there now, and that's sort of an entitled set of parking connected to office leases, and so one goal is to rebuild that to meet those demands. The second challenge on parking this area is what parking demand will be made of the future development. The parking freeze, as I understand it, is primarily focused on standalone commercial garages that just serve as parking all by themselves. So you can't take a parcel and build a parking garage and rent out parking spaces. The parking that would be contemplated by this development would be as an accessory use to the commercial and residential buildings. And we would certainly like to explore how we can rewrite the zoning to require as little parking as possible, because of our interest in driving people to use transit, and B, it's really expensive. Every parking space is a huge investment that we would rather put towards other uses. So we will try to push the parking envelope as far as possible on both the housing requirements and the commercial requirements. I'm not sure if Melissa or anyone else has anything else to say about the parking demand. Nope. Okay.
Thanks, Tom. Well, we do have a question from Heather. If you could read that.
Yep, so I can read that, Chuck. So Heather asks, will any thought be given to the additional gentrification and other housing pressure that an extra 800,000 square feet of commercial development not offset by any housing will create?
So I'm trying to, there we go. So to Heather's question about housing pressure, and I mean, I think that there are two different issues. There's gentrification and housing pressure, which I think I would say would need to be decoupled a little bit as we think about what we're able to provide. The issue for new development Kendall Square is providing additional housing demand in the region. That's not really debated. The solution to the housing demand for Kendall Square is something that's not really solvable just by Kendall Square, but is actually needs to be something that's looked at regionally and certainly by the city. I think that it's worth looking at the contribution that the new linkage fee will require from the commercial development to add additional resources to the city's affordable housing trust. So that helps with the affordable side. And we are continuing to work with the state to find other opportunities to increase housing density in places around Kendall. One of the places we've actually thought should still be in a conversation as a housing site is the FULKERSON site, but I know that there's also been some pressure for that to be used for open space. Anything else that anyone want to add, Melissa, on the housing side? No.
Oh, am I there? Am I unmuted
Okay.
now?
Yeah.
Sorry. No, I think you're right, Tom. I mean, this is going to enable us to deliver the housing in one phase rather than two. So from that standpoint, it would be all of the housing delivered, sooner for people to real homes for people to live in a faster time frame. So I think that's a good aspect of this proposal.
Thanks, Melissa. So we also have another question from Lee Old, and it has a few different parts, so I'll read it now. I'm glad the substation will not be on Fulkerson. Who should have the impact of paying for the relocation of the substation? Residents or large property owners? As I see it, residents are paying by having 800,000 of additional density added to the city, but commercial property owners are the ones who need the additional electricity. This does not seem fair to residents. Why is this the right solution? And why can the substation not be located on the Volpe parcel, for example? Then there are a few additional questions asking, where will the additional 800,000 square foot building go? What is the earliest timetable for beginning to change the zoning? And will the Q&A be produced from the meeting? And I can handle that one. And yes, I'm taking all of the questions that are asked on the phone and questions that are being asked in the chat and aggregating them into a Google document now. And yes, that will be provided.
So there's a lot of questions here. I'll try to get at a couple. The Volpe parcel, as mentioned here, is actually still owned by the federal government. Matimco does not have what we would call site control of that until they deliver the new building to the GSA. So the ironic element of that is that, yes, there's some underutilized land on the Volpe parcel, but it's not something that can be easily negotiated or promised to EverSource, as the deal with the federal government does not provide that land to local control for some years to come. The component about where the 800,000 square feet of commercial building, what we're looking at, as I illustrated earlier, is that one location for about approximately 400,000 square foot building would be on the north side of the parking garage site. And we're also taking a close look at the parcel next to it, which is a low two-story industrial property at also on BINNEY. Those are two places that have been looked at, although the site planning for the block and the arrangement of not only the substation, but the parking, I think will influence where those parcels end up. We hope to, once we get some good, clear answers from EverSource, to be able to come back in a new form and start to show some of the options for where those buildings can go.
And the timetable question.
Oh, yes. The driver on time is backing out from what EverSource sees as when they need to submit their application to the state. As we last spoke, it was their goal was to put in the alternative site as their preferred site into the site review board process at the beginning of next year, first quarter of 2021. In order to offer the site to them, the zoning and redevelopment decisions would have to be made by that time. So towards the end of this year, early next year.
Great, thanks, Tom. We have another question from Bob. Actually, there's three questions. First, what will you do to compensate for the open space needs for all of this additional space? 2, how will this project relate to Matimco's Volpe requirement for usable public open space? And 3, what is the population of Kendall now, and what will it be with all of the proposed development in place?
So we're looking at the open space options right now. And so enhancements to the existing open space and finding other spaces that can be improved as open space is something we're diving into in the site planning process. We can't create more land within the MXD. So I think what we're going to focus on is how can we be creative with the sites that we're working with, and some areas that may be very underutilized today. And we're looking across the street, actually, on the south side of Broadway, to look at some of the alleys and underutilized spaces that are, I would say they're open, they have grass, they might have trees, but they're not really seen as parks. And so Alex has been leading an effort in our office to start imagining what more could be done with some of those open spaces. So I think that is a key item we will come back to once we have some more clear site plans in play. See what other notes. There's no specific spatial requirements to Matimco's Volpe requirements for their 2 to 3 acres of open space requirements. The only thing I say at this point of time is that we will work to serve strong connections between the open space that we have now in the MXD open space connections we're looking to enhance in the block, to Volpe's site plan once those become visible. And actually earlier this week was having a conversation with CDD about how we can start looking at these site plans together rather than two separate processes. So, Boston Properties owns most of the land on one parcel, but Timco is doing the planning for the federally owned parcel on the other side. And the city and the CRA want to work to make sure that those two planning processes stitch together as best as possible so we can deliver a strong open space system. Alex, I noticed in your notes that there is a question from Chris Matthews.
Yes.
Also.
Yes, thank you. So that came in at the very beginning, and I think it's a comment. He noted, this is a very large upzoning. It should come with significant community benefits. A connection between our two neighborhood schools and their parks would be suitable.
Okay.
I also see that James has his hand raised again. So, and I also see, James, you have a comment. So perhaps I can let you speak now. You are unmuted.
Well, thanks. I guess I'll just read since I've been typing. If I can hold on just a sec. So here's what I first wrote. Thanks for recognizing me. So Tom just said, this is now a couple of minutes ago, Tom just said that they are, quote, working with the state on finding presumably more regional solutions to the housing issues that were alluded to. If that is the case, returning to Tom's response to an earlier question, why can there not be similar collaboration with the state and other regional partners on finding more balanced solutions just to the distribution of commercial real estate development itself in and near Kendall, which is what's driving all of this. So that does not all have to happen in this area of Cambridge. So I'm sort of, given what Tom said about housing, why can't we, this is a political question, a question of policy and politics, as well as economic development in a more theoretical way. I'm asking the question, which I think is underlying a lot of the concerns that are expressed by people in the city, is why does it have to all happen and happen in this way in Kendall? And then the next separate thing that I return to, just by way of emphasis, returning to the citywide parking freeze. I'm not sure, Tom, that your understanding is correct. It may be, but I think at some point this needs to be clarified for people who live in the city, at least not the often referenced one mandated in a settlement under the Clean Air Act quite a few years ago. That's the one I'm referring to. So I think there needs to be clarity about the longstanding parking freeze and how it might apply here. Perhaps it should apply here. Some worry that it has been ignored by the city of Cambridge officially for years, and I wonder if there is any truth to that. I think this should be investigated, interrogated, and clarified for the public as part of this evolving discussion. So, and thank you, appreciate it.
So I'll look deeper into the parking freeze you referenced, and I assume that that's the parking freeze that also is layered over downtown Boston. And so we'll get some more information together on that. The regional commercial development question, there are three layers of answering that. One is we are talking about providing entitlements for a private property owner that is trying to make a gesture to help a problem that the city manager approached them on of moving the EVERSOURCE substation. So thus it is a city ask to find a solution. I would say that also one of the challenges with all development, both housing and commercial, is that those are all local decisions throughout the region. There is actually not a whole lot of regional coordination. But I would also argue that if you're going to continue to see growth in biotech and the tech industry, which I think we're very fortunate to have a strong economy up to a few weeks ago, and I think it will play out that Cambridge will recover much more quickly than many areas of the world because of the concentration of intellectual capital in Kendall Square. And I think if you're going to have it in Boston and in the Boston region, on the Red Line is the right place for new development. And so if we were to not have commercial development on Kendall, it might go to Somerville. It also could go to Waltham. Apologies to folks that may work on developments in Waltham on the call. But when I put on a regional planner hat, I see that the Red Line and the Blue Line and the Orange Line are all the places we should be focusing our regional development growth in a concentrated way. Kendall has a very specific commercial attraction because of the strong synergies of technology and biotech research that's a lot of it spins off of MIT. And I have to say, right now, I think we also value that concentration of firepower in the biotech industry facing the crisis we have today. So I think biotech in specific has a important role to play societally that I think we can't ignore right now.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Peter Crawley. Why 800,000 square feet of new development versus a much lower amount? What financial calculations support the need for 800,000 square feet? And can you share those calculations with city councilors? Assuming Boston Properties will own the 800,000 square feet, what direct payments will be made by Boston Properties for public benefits, such as buying more open space, as well as what payments will be made to CRA? Will Boston Properties pay market rate for 800,000 square feet of entitlements to the city/CRA? And what will the city/CRA use that money for?
Tom, do you want me to grab that?
You can start with it, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, the 800,000 feet is derived from preliminary calculations on the exceptional cost of taking the existing parking, which is under commitment to multiple tenants, and putting it underground. Below grade parking is a very large expense, as I mentioned earlier, particularly in the urban context. And that's just to make a site available. You then have the normal costs associated with developments, many of which were benchmarked to what can only be described now as a different market and different world, the pre-COVID-19 world. What rents and costs will look like coming out of this is anybody's guess. But the normal cost of development on top of the massive undertaking of relocating the parking underground include things like the incentive zoning housing payment, which I think Melissa referenced earlier, and Tom. And yes, to answer the question specifically, we have a development management agreement with the CRA where we pay them a fee for the land, and they have put that to use at the discretion of their board and staff with public input for things like the nonprofit road project. But Tom can speak to that much better.
So yeah, to Peter's question about how we would use it, I think that is a conversation that we would be happy to host with the CRA board as we start contemplating what we would do with those funds. We obviously have a lot of ideas about how we would like to continue to expand our investment in the community, whether it's within the Foundry or some of our nonprofit partners that own properties that need to be reinvested in, and probably a new surge of economic development needs coming out of our current situation. The other component of your question about financial calculations, we will conduct our own analysis through our real estate consultant team, which will put forth a report, and we will try to be as transparent about that as possible. We've done that in the past. We did some analysis for the Volpe site with the city, and we will make those assumptions and analysis public to City Council and to the public as much as possible. I might say that these are very odd times to be making projections. And so anyone doing an analysis of development value into the future is going to have a kind of a hard time making anything as far as a speculative guess. And that's one of the challenges about doing development, is that you have to make plans for what might be the market value of a building. It's going to take you 4 years to put on the market. And so we will conduct that analysis, and we'll probably have lots of footnotes saying we'll have to take our best guess as how the market returns.
Thanks. Does anyone else have any additional questions? I don't see any Q&As that have popped up, and I don't see any hands raised. So if you do have any other questions, let us know now. Alan Green, I see that you have your hand raised, so I'm going to unmute you. There you go. Alan? Alan, I think you need to unmute yourself as well.
Okay, how's that?
Great.
All right. I wanted to get back to Chris Matthews' comment or question about the possibility of what's going to be used, what's the present checker cab site, what is that going to be used for? In the neighborhood, there's been some talk of possibly extending the open space from the school to that side, and then carry it over with the pedestrian bridge over to the Linden Park side, where there's another park there to link the two neighborhoods, and also allow us a way to cross the Grand Junction Railway, which we can at present, other than via Broadway or Cambridge Street. So I'm wondering, from your end, what do you foresee for that particular site? What's happening there? Another possibility was to have a blend of open space and also residential there.
So I think that that's a process the city has committed to asking community input on. We have, in a much earlier planning study, looked at a connection across the Grand Junction rail line between the Wellington-Harrington neighborhood and East Cambridge. And I think that that's an interesting idea to explore, especially in conjunction with the work going on about putting the multi-use path along the Grand Junction. Our initial study actually was looking at whether an at-grade crossing could be put there, much like the crossing down at Washington Park by MIT. But that's something that we understand that the rail folks at the state are not interested in adding any more at-grade options. And as I mentioned before, though right now the rail service there is not very heavily used, we see a future where that could be used much more thoroughly. So a connection across that rail track needs to plan out for what we would hope would be a transit future for that corridor. But I think that there's definitely more workshops and planning efforts to come to define the future use of the Fulkerson site.
Great. Do we have any other questions? Oh, I see we have another one from Bob. Bob's asking how many people are there in Kendall Square now, and how many when development has finished? Who is responsible for determining the public infrastructure requirements for this population?
Well, hopefully in the next month, we'll have some better data about population counts in Kendall Square. With the census actually we won't get that data for 9 months. Kendall Square has been a really interesting piece to get residential data from because the census usually uses its most recent census survey, and then does the American Community Survey and does projections of growth based on limited sampling. And that's always shown Kendall Square to be much less populated than what we expect from the amount of residential development that's gone on. So since the last census, we've more than doubled the number of housing units in Kendall Square. So the data is not great that we have right now, but we can try to get better estimates from other data sources beyond the census. And hopefully if everyone fills out their census, we'll have good data to come. But it is, I assume that was a very much focused on the residential population. The daytime population for employments is a number that we've pegged at between 60 and 70,000 employees on some of our data work, but that's also been a hard number to gather because some of the companies there actually have people who are employed by them at multiple sites, and they may not spend all of their work days at a site in Kendall. And so getting a great employment number has been hard. We often use a number just based on a square footage count. But up until recently, we were finding that people were using square footage much more intensely in some of the office buildings around Kendall Square than what we may have previously assumed was between 250 and 300 square feet per employee. So that's also probably some data that needs to be recalibrated moving forward.
Yeah, if we could have some people who haven't spoken yet, asked a question yet. Currently, we have 45 participants that are left on the call. And I would like to hear from some people who haven't talked yet. People having trouble raising their hands, I'm not sure, but I'd like to take a few more questions, and we've got this till 8:30 scheduled, so I'd like to fill up the time with questions if we can. Thanks.
If anyone is having a hard time raising their hand, feel free to email planning@cambridgeredevelopment.org, and I'll also receive that. All right, I do see that Heather asked another question. She said, I think I didn't explain my point very well, but other questions have hinted at it as well. We in the residential neighborhood did not create the EverSource problem, but we are expected to pay for it in full. Commercial developers expect to be compensated for helping to solve a problem they created, but we get all the fallout. Our homes have become more and more unaffordable. Our kids can't live where they grow up, and it becomes harder and harder for us to stay. Why are we the only ones expected to pay any price without compensation?
I can do my best with that one, Tom. I think it's as much of a statement as a question. The question parts of it that I glean out of it, I can only answer on behalf of a limited swath of the development community. We were asked a year ago if we had some way to meaningfully contribute to a solution to EverSource not being located on FULKERSON, and that's what we've come up with. We have this. As to the rest of the statements and to some of our other people and colleagues, again, I point to Alexandria as being very instrumental in helping us get here, and we certainly welcome participation by others, Heather.
Thanks, and James, your links and references to the parking freeze have been noted.
Hey, do we have anybody else who'd like to ask a question or clarify something that was on the slides that you didn't completely understand? Oh.
So I'll just say, Chuck, given especially the unusual format of this meeting, we will commit to, well, maybe if we have to, we'll do another one of these or other types of formats. Hopefully we're able to meet in person sometime in the next month or two. We're also working on putting together a co-urbanized website, which can create an online forum as we get information about the site design and some of the technical issues. We will post that there and be able to answer questions as that comes up. It's a tool that we've used in the past on a number of properties, whether the Foundry or previous version of zoning and MXD. as well as other developers. And so we think that in these challenging times, that's another forum that we can put forth out there for continued updates and conversation. We also hope to have some kind of in-person town hall where we could have the EVERSOURCE technical team there as well, and so just sort of an open house where people are able to pepper them with all the electricity questions that the panel on this call are not able or not qualified to even put a guest forward. So that's all to say that the conversation doesn't really end here. It is just the beginning, and we look forward to further participation, hopefully in person as soon as possible.
And if people have questions still, they can still email to the address that was put up earlier. And we can, if you could send us those answers and questions as people send them in, we can post them on our Google group.
Okay.
Great. And just to answer Bob's last question, the slides will be available on the CRA's website. And I know it's also been provided to Chuck, who can distribute it on the ECPT listserv.
Okay, at this point, I would like to thank all our participants, especially Alex for coordinating all this, and everybody who's on the call right now. We have still 42 people left that are listening, and just like to say thank you for everybody for tuning in. Okay.
Thanks for the opportunity, Chuck.
Thank you, Chuck, and thank you for CCTV hosting us on television.
Good point.
Yes, thank you all.
All right.
Okay. Meeting adjourned.
All right.